Okay, good morning, everybody. This is not my presentation because I didn't use this fancy first slide, so that's why I recognize it's not mine. So we'll sort that out immediately. So my name is Bert Brys, or what you know. I'm from Belgium, from the Flemish part, so I speak Dutch. So in Dutch we say basically my name is Bert Brys. But as I work in the OECD, which is very much native speakers, English speakers can't pronounce the typical Dutch sounds. So that name has changed immediately. So my name now is Bert Brys or Bert Brys or whatever. So you could call me whatever you want. You say Bert or Bert, it's all fine. Yes.
And you have the clicker.
Perfect. So I'm here. I work in the OECD in the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration, is where basically all the tax work of the OECD takes place. I'm here with a colleague, Piers O'Reilly. We'll give a lot of tax presentations during the week. Basically, it's a real privilege to be here and an honor to talk about this topic, tax and inclusive growth in a changing world. And the aim of this presentation, basically what I'll try to do is to bring that passion to work for and with governments. That's really an honor. I really feel that it's really an honor to work for governments as we do in the OECD. And I'll bring that passion that we feel for tax. Many people in the world think that tax is the most boring topic in the world. I can tell you that is totally the opposite, because the societies are changing all the time, so tax systems need to be changed all the time in response and to work together with these changes that occur in society. And I'll try to bring that passion to you. So the topic of today is, let me see how this functions. That functions perfectly. Is about tax design for inclusive growth. So first, let me then define what inclusive growth is. You see that in blue there on the slide. Economic growth that delivers progress to all groups of the population. That basically the growth dividends, so economic growth, but the growth dividends are shared across society and increase well-being of everyone. That's basically inclusive growth. You can ask yourself, well, why do we focus on inclusive growth? Because in the past we always talked about growth. That was the aim of policy. It was trying to get as much growth as possible. Did that mean that in the past we didn't care about redistribution, about the sharing of that growth? Of course we did. Everyone, the inclusive redistribution, equity issues always have been part of the agenda. But there was this strong belief that if you create a lot of economic growth, that growth would automatically trickle down to everyone, and everyone would automatically win if you would just stimulate and create a lot of economic growth. So basically, if you make a bit of an abstraction, there is that fairness was almost like a consequence, an automatic consequence of economic growth. That was basically the belief for many, many, many decades, basically. And then the financial economic crisis hit the world, and we realized then that it's not that easy at all, that there are many people that are basically left behind because of economic growth, that not everyone automatically wins if a society has a lot of economic growth. And so that clearly reflected in the economic crisis. There were, certain groups of population were hit very hard, while others a lot less, and there were also particular groups of society were even at the origin of that crisis, and these are not necessarily the ones that bear the burden of that crisis. So this asymmetry between winners and losers, that became really core of our understanding. And basically, once you start then looking at these issues, we'll see a lot of recent trends that basically make that asymmetry even more visible, or might make it even more stronger as we go. Clearly, what has happened, that we see, is that the world is going through a fascinating phase of more globalization, but not everyone wins of globalization. There, some people do, but many people don't. Linked to that also is globalization brought and is gonna bring, because of technological change, is gonna bring a lot more automation, which you will see again that some people, the ones who have the right skills, will win, but many people might lose their job because they were replaced by robots, and they might lose. So again, an asymmetry between winners and losers. What we see also in the data is that there is a slowdown in productivity. We see on the one hand, part of digitalization, you have some very big companies, very technological companies, who become bigger and bigger, are very, very profitable on the one hand. And so working for these businesses, might be very good, but you have a lot of other companies who are lagging behind. And there is a lack of diffusion that we see at the moment, lack of diffusion of these technologies of the big, very profitable modern companies. There's a lack of diffusion of these technologies and skills into these other firms. So you have more winners and firms that are lagging behind. Linked to that is that we see more and more skills challenges. You have people who have the right skills, and because of all the changes, you have many people who don't have the appropriate skills, which creates a lot of challenges. I can give you there. My girlfriend basically is a translator, and so that's it's not necessarily. I think if I would have to advise someone what to study, translating is not necessarily the type of degree you want to invest in, because all of these tasks over time are going to be replaced. These are automatable skills. Perhaps not yet, but over time, these type of jobs will be replaced. So if you have invested in skills of someone who translates, well, you might be in trouble if you don't retrain or you don't try to find another route where you can use your skills. So again, a divide between winners and losers. All of that, if you bring all these trends together, what we'll see is that we see wage stagnation across many countries in the OECD. Now, let me stress here, I'm taking here really an OECD perspective. I'm not, in my talk, I'll refer now and then to South Africa, but I'm, in all modesty, I'm not an expert of the South African challenges. But what we see across the OECD is that winners take it all. You have people, the top earners start earning a lot more, continuously more, while other people you see in the middle class, in some countries even like disappearing middle classes, and a lot significant wage stagnation for many. So these are the broad contexts, these are the issues that we talk about. That's why we talk about inclusive growth. How can the tax and the transfer system help to address some of these issues? And it's obvious that the tax system not necessarily is always the first best solution to these issues. These are broad economic challenges that the tax system can help. There's often a second best tool, but there's a wider set of reforms necessary in order to build inclusive societies. So there is, and I'll make that very clear in this talk, is there is a strong role for a tax and transfer system to help create, to get to a situation where growth, and on the one hand, growth is stimulated, and on the other hand, that growth is distributed fairly across society. It is my strong view that market forces in themselves cannot be left alone. It's often in case of the absence of a strong government that often these divides between winners and losers become a lot stronger. So there is an enormous role of government to build these inclusive societies, to get into inclusive growth. And it's my personal view that in countries where the role of government has been neglected, that you often see this divide between winners and losers a lot more strongly. So this is is a call, also because, you are considering or have started and hopefully will start your career in government. This is here a strong call for a strong government and for all of your engagement in helping to build that strong government in a way to get into, to stimulate that inclusive growth. So what will I do in this presentation? This was just not even the introduction. This is basically the introductory slide. So this is the introduction of the introduction. That's my problem. I've got only 45 minutes and I've got so many stories to tell that I already know that I will be in trouble at the end. Anyway, what I try to do here is I'll define to you a bit more first what inclusive growth means. I will show some data, what basically is going on in the world. And then I'll take a step back. I'll remind you of the role of government. Often that is, when you talk about tax design for inclusive growth, well, tax is an instrument that government uses. So it's important to remember what is the role of government. And to remember, okay, what instruments do governments have? Tax is one of the tools, but there are many others. And we'll focus, of course, on tax. Once we have identified that there's a role for tax, I'm going to briefly tell you how you should design your tax system, how we ideally design a tax system first in general, and then apply it to this concept of inclusive growth. So you see, it's a long venue that we're going to take together. Anyway, so I already talked about, what in definition of inclusive growth. So this inclusive growth also refers to then inclusive markets, where that refers already to the fact that some firms are lagging behind. It's also about inclusive labor markets to ensure that it's not only the happy few who get a nice salary, but that basically there are good quality jobs for everyone. And then, which is very important in work on inclusive growth, both in the OECD and in other organizations, is that we want to go beyond this static perspective of the functioning of a tax system or in general government policies. And we want to take a more broader dynamic approach to tax policy design. We want to focus on a life cycle perspective, and I'll show some data on that. Inclusive growth is also focusing on social mobility, that basically everyone gets an opportunity to participate, and I'll focus on that. It's about well-being across generations, and clearly it's also about gender equity, which is very important. Let me just go on and show you some first slides to describe a bit further what's going. I've been told that this presentation will be uploaded to a website, so on some of the slides I will go relatively briefly, but the information is there. It's also for your background information and afterwards to continue reading the material if you're interested. This slide shows after tax and transfer Gini coefficient. So Gini coefficient measures the degree of inequality, and a ratio of 1 means perfect total inequality, is that all the income is one person gets all the income. Gini coefficient of 0 means that everything after tax and transfer, everyone in your society gets exactly the same. So the higher the coefficient, the more unequal. This shows the Gini coefficient after taking into account taxes and transfers. And what we see in the OECD is that inequality has been going up since the beginning of the mid-80s until the latest data that is available. And there's several reasons for that. First, because market incomes get more unequal. Second, also because the tax system has become less redistributive. And thirdly, because transfers have become less redistributive. So on the progressivity of the tax systems, basically the tax systems have become less progressive at the top, so higher incomes need to pay less tax than in the 80s. On the other hand, the progressivity at the bottom of the income distribution has gone up, so that offsets partly the effect on the higher incomes. But the transfer system has become less redistributive, leading to that overall effect. Also, what we see is that when we talk about inequality, we often focus on income inequality. But there are other dimensions of inequality. There's wealth inequality and there's consumption inequality. And in order to assess the impact of taxes and transfers on inequality, you basically need to combine these three dimensions, both income, wealth, and consumption inequality. This combines income and wealth inequality. So you see on average, across 18 OECD countries, so the income, how income is distributed in the blue bars. So the share of in total income that each decile has got. So you see that the top decile has a larger share of income. But then we see the gray shows wealth inequality. And what we see is that wealth is a lot more unequally distributed than income. So it's important to focus on wealth. And I've understood, and Piers will have a presentation on that, I think, later tomorrow or on the third day about wealth taxes. But it's our view that not necessarily a wealth tax is the best way to go, but it is crucial, and I'll talk about that as well, is to focus more on a fair taxation of capital income at the individual level, including a strong role for inheritance taxes, in order to address high wealth inequalities. On top of what we've seen is that this shows the tax to GDP ratios on average across the OECD. So one of the roles of perhaps even the most important role of a tax system is to collect revenue, is to get revenue. And the more revenue you got, well, the more revenue you can share, you can distribute. So the main role there, and that's important, so the more you have, the more you can, if you would wish as a government, redistribute to the poor. And so that's why I show this slide, is despite the fact that I just presented that the overall redistributive effect of tax systems have gone down, the total amount of taxes collected has gone up considerably since the beginning of the mid-60s, when we started collecting this data, until 2015. I was not working at the OECD at 65. So on average, 34.3% of GDP is collected revenue. So that is considerably higher on average than what you collect in South Africa. Also, what we see is that the top personal income tax rates have gone down considerably, well, more than considerably, really. In the beginning of the 80s, what was that? See on slide, 66% was the top personal income tax rate on average in the OECD. This is the range, so there were countries with like almost, what is that, 90% the top PIT rate, which is like, of course, crazy. That is expropriation, basically, you know. So and you see now the average top PIT rate in the OECD is about 33%. So you are with 45, you are close to that average. So we've seen a decrease in top PIT rates, which explains to some extent, or to a considerable extent, why tax systems have become less redistributive. On the other hand, what we also see is that this slide shows the trend in the corporate income tax rate. So as part of focusing on the tax burden on capital income, that the corporate tax rate also has gone down considerably. It was like 33% at the beginning of the 2000s on average in the OECD, and it's now something about 24%. So you see these trends towards lower tax rates. On the other hand, you see a shift from direct towards indirect taxes. This slide shows across the OECD the change in the VAT rate, the standard VAT rate, which has gone after the crisis considerably up. Why? Countries needed a lot of revenue to finance the big budget deficits and the problems created by banks. And the VAT is a big revenue raiser, and it is one of the taxes that are least distortive for economic growth, and we'll come back to that. So you see, on average across the OECD, 19%. So your 15%, that is not that high, and we've heard there's a lot of still protest of this increase from 14 to 15%, which is basically a non-discussion. That is, and decreasing the VAT rate back to 40% would be, honestly, from an economic and a tax policy perspective, a very bad idea. Anyway, so 19%. Now, this is not only about me. I want to address myself also to you. I've got a lot of questions for you and basically an invitation to make. So, yeah, the floor is yours. We'll see. I'll come back to that. So, the question that I basically have for you is, to what extent, if you look at your income, your wealth, and your consumption distribution, how fair is that? You know, your view. What if you look at South African income distribution, wealth distribution? To which extent is that distribution fair? And how would you want to see that change over, let's say, the next 10 years? My question is, how do you see economic growth in your country contributing to that change in the distribution of income and wealth over time? And where are the difficulties? Where are the hurdles for inclusive growth in South Africa? Can economic participation be improved? Are there skills challenges? Are there certain groups that are left behind? How can these groups be lifted up? How can you all grow together? Why is productivity low? Where are your productivity challenges in your economy? Are there governance challenges? And any other question in that context that you can ask yourself. Then, of course, I'm a tax economist. How can the tax and benefit system contribute to going to that inclusive growth society, to that inclusive society? That's one of the things that I wanted to stress. And I have very interesting discussions with my colleagues, Piers, because he doesn't really believe in that terminology, because this inclusive growth becomes so broad that you at one point no longer really know what it means. But I strongly believe in that concept of an inclusive society. So either grow all together or eventually you don't grow. It's going together. I think that's the strength of certain societies. And that's what that's really my personal view. If you see like a country like Belgium, where it has got this enormous tax burden, the power of a country like that is that you grow really together, that the divide between groups is relatively small, despite the fact that you have this difference between Flemish, Dutch speakers and French speakers. That's, every country in the world has got its own challenges. So how can the tax system contribute to creating that inclusive society? And then I want to focus on the short run and on the medium run. How do you see the role of your tax system in the short run to get to inclusive growth, in getting growth and then redistribute that growth? And how can the tax and benefit system also achieve and contribute in the medium run? And do you see challenges and obstacles between policies in the short run and getting to a better situation in the medium and the long run? Which obviously there is. If you would say you have extreme income redistribution today. Imagine you would say you introduce a top bit rate of 95% that hits at average incomes. Imagine you would do something crazily like that. You would have enormous income redistribution immediately. But of course that would totally destroy economic activity in your country. So that you would redistribute a lot today, but tomorrow you would be in a lot worse situation. So there are clearly challenges between short-run policies and achieving medium-run objectives. So that the invitation is for you to share your views. You have my email address there. If you feel like making a contribution, well, develop the arguments. Spend some time. I'm very keen on learning from you. I'll gather all of these your contributions. I'll make sure you get the credit. It's your name. It's not mine. I'll gather it. It's your name. I've received this book. I've got everyone's email address and picture, so I can visualize you. And I'll promise you, I'll share that with Treasury, so we can see how far we go. I mean, if no one does this, well, then nothing really will happen. But if this gets successful, I'll try to make a story, and I'll share that with Treasury. And who knows, that can be then, the start of something, fruitful discussion with colleagues in Treasury on how to get to inclusive growth for South Africa. Now, I have to look at not because this thing starts beeping, but I need to keep track of time. So So what is the role of government? I want to very, very briefly remind you of the role of government before we start talking about tax policy. Because it's important when you design a tax system that you actually have the core concepts and the core principles clear in mind, because honestly there are too many people who make too much noise about, everyone thinks that he knows how or she knows how to design a tax system. You should really, it's not, it has to be developed properly, and that's what I basically starts with. What is the role for government? Well, of course, create a legal framework, setting rules. And then importantly is that the role of government is to improve the functioning of markets. Often markets don't function properly. So leaving markets on their own often leads to very bad outcomes. You see that, look at the financial crisis created by all these bankers in the US. I shouldn't name countries, but bon, that's now so an obvious example. That's the greed of some who have put a lot of misery on the large majority of the population. So there is a clear role for regulation. You see there the different instances in the presence of externalities. I'll talk about that. In case there's imperfect competition, in case there is asymmetric information, and in case even if people are not perfectly rational. These are based on our standard economic framework of all our neoclassical economists that we know when the basic conditions of our economic theories are not satisfied, that markets won't be perfect. So in these circumstances that will be the case. So there is a role for government to intervene. A very important role for government is, of course, to redistribute income and to finance public goods. I already spoke about externalities. This is probably for most of you obvious, so perhaps I don't need to spend too much time on that. But what is an externality? An externality, you see it defined there, when something is produced or consumed that causes an impact on third parties which are not directly related or taken into account in the transaction. I make it very clear. I used to smoke a long time ago, but someone who smokes basically if I would smoke here, I create a smoke, and the smoke is bad for your health, but I don't take that into account when I smoke. No. That's basically, we get immediately to the tax discussion. That's why it's very good to have taxes on cigarettes, because by taxing, I basically internalize these negative external effects. And so you have different type of external effects. You see, when social costs exceed private costs, that's in terms of smoking, pollution, or when private returns exceed the societal returns, is when these bankers in the US they made a very big private return. But that private return was not very well aligned with the return that society got. Well, society got a negative return. So these bankers got super rich, society bore the cost. It's a negative external effect, so that means there's reason for government to intervene. These are negative external effects, and you have also positive external effects. Positive external effect is like if you have a company that innovates and might set a lot of other economic activity in motion. The original company that innovated might not get that return. There might other companies or other people that benefit from that return. So in some cases there are arguments to stimulate innovation, including through the tax system. Also, when we talk about externalities, I stress that because I think that's an important argument. Linked to that is often also the case of missing markets. In case there is not a market, it's also a role for government to intervene. Like often there is, like in the case of pollution, there is no market. There was no, at least we're now moving towards that with carbon taxes, for instance. But if there's no market for pollution, if pollution is for free, what you basically get is that everyone pollutes, as people don't care, businesses don't care, just pollute. There's no market, there's no price mechanism. So you can try whatever type of policy. If there's no market, that won't work. Of course, then a big role for government is income redistribution, and there clearly is a role there for the tax and transfer system. Of course, redistribution, higher taxes, progressive taxes that come at a cost because that can become very distortive. Now, there is one of these, I was almost going to say new concepts, but at the end it's not really new because as far as I understand that concept of equality of opportunity has been introduced by Rawls in the 20s, so that is a very old concept, although it's in practice, and the World Bank has done some work on that, on measuring the extent of equality of opportunity in societies. I think that's a very interesting area for further work for sure also. It's what you get with income redistribution that is very nice effect is that, or is that people who, a progressive tax system is like people who have higher income are taxed at higher rates than people who have lower income. And that itself is often strange because the one who puts more effort, who works harder, has more income than someone who prefers to lie at the beach. And what the tax system does is basically then it punishes the ones who work harder. So there's a bit of a difficulty with progressivity and progressive tax systems. It's because we do not want to discourage people from giving a lot of effort. So this is not a call against, of course, progressive taxation, but it's to see that when we use income as a measure of implementing, to have more equality, it becomes also a bit distortive to that extent that you punish people who put more effort. So what is important as well is to focus on equality of opportunity, that we organize government such that everyone in society has got the same possibility, same opportunity to participate in that economy, to develop his or her skills, to do basically what he or she wants, to earn income and to be happy and whatever. And that's often where in societies it goes wrong, where certain groups don't get that same chance, or where people from poor families, you see that typically there's a lot of data and analysis for the US, because the US has got a lot of data, so there's a lot of analysis done for the US, is that people from poor backgrounds, so the parents were poor, that the children have a very high probability of remaining poor. So these are issues, these are main challenges, because that's a lack of opportunity and that hurts economic and inclusive growth. Let me go on. So then we come to just this to taxes as one of the instruments, but I've added there's a long list of other instruments and tools that government has available, and so often we as tax economists perhaps do that often too little. One should ask him or herself, which instrument should government use? Do you want to regulate? Do you want to say, well, smoking is forbidden? Instead of saying, no, we're not going to forbid, but we're going to tax at a very high rate. The outcomes, of course, are different. The advantage, of course, of having a tax is that you collect a lot of revenues, so which you then can use for other purposes, for income redistribution, for instance. Now, once we have agreed that, yes, there is a strong role for government, and yes, we want to use a tax system, then the obvious question is, how should we design a tax system? What are the key criteria to design a tax system? There, the first criteria, well, the most important criteria is the revenue raising capacity. And that's always basically when I have an interview at the OECD, when someone comes in for a job at the OECD, I often ask, how would you want to, what are the roles, what's the role of a tax system? How would you want to want to design your tax system? And basically no one ever talks about that revenue raising capacity, which is very strange because that's basically the most important role of a tax system, is to collect that revenue so you finance your defense, you pay for the roads, you can redistribute income. That's the main role. But then going beyond that, how do we want to design a tax system? Well, we want to have the taxes as efficient as possible, meaning we assume that the situation, the market equilibrium, market outcome, in the absence of taxes is the ideal. And so we want to design a tax system so that we deviate as little as possible from that no tax situation. So we want to distort the economy as little as possible when we levy taxes. That's basically one of the most important guiding principles on how to design. So behavior without taxes is optimal. And when we introduce a tax, we start distorting. Imagine you have no taxes on the one hand. So you have people on goods, so there's no tax, so you consume whatever you want. Then we introduce a tax, and we would only tax one good and not another good. What will we do? Well, some people who consumed first the good that we now tax, they will start changing their behavior and they will start consuming more of the other good. So we distort that situation that occurred in the absence of taxes. And we don't want to do that. We want to do that as little as possible. So that means, and perhaps you're all familiar with the typical Harburger triangle, this famous economist who got the Nobel Prize with this deadweight loss and with triangles and all this demand and supply curves and so on. So we want to have these deadweight losses, these excess burdens as small as possible. A key result in that literature is that the higher the tax rates, the more we distort. So the policy conclusion or consequence of that is we want to keep rates as low as possible, while at the same time keep our tax bases as broad as possible. Where many countries deviate from that, including my own country is probably the champion in that. We're often very narrow bases, and if your tax base is very narrow, you need to levy a very high tax rate in order to raise sufficient revenues. And by doing so, you start distorting a lot. You start creating a lot of loopholes and avoidance behavior and so on. So you shouldn't follow Belgium's example. You should keep your tax base as broad as possible and your rates as low as possible. Like, for instance, what you have, like with your VAT, you have a very broad VAT base, which is great, and a relatively low VAT rate, which is a lot better which is very good. So that means we should tax goods and services that are basically inelastic in demand. So you have some goods that, even if you tax at a higher rate, that people don't change their behavior anyway. So that's the perfect good to tax. That's why we have very high taxes on cigarettes. Because on the one hand, because these are these external effects, but people don't change their behavior because they are addicted. So that's why you want to tax. The same is with a house. Housing, property taxes are a good tax. Why? Well, once you bought your house, there's not much you can do because it's there. You can't take it up and go and live somewhere else. So inelastic tax bases are good tax bases. So we want to, on the contrary, something which is very mobile, like foreign direct investment. You have a multinational who can either invest here or in a neighboring country. That capital is very mobile. If you would tax that capital at a very high rate, that capital won't come. So something which is very mobile is more difficult to tax. So if you would tax it, you would distort because that capital won't come. So high distortion, we want to tax less, which is, of course, not an argument for no taxation on capital income, on the contrary. Voilà. This is crucial. Now, when we apply these efficiency arguments on taxation, and we've done a lot of work on tax and economic growth, is that you have some taxes who are a lot more distortive for growth than other taxes. Like the corporate income tax and the personal income tax, in particular, when you levy personal income taxes at too high tax rates, become very distortive. So you don't want to levy direct taxes at too high rates. On the other hand, consumption taxes are less distortive for economic growth, and recurrent taxes on immovable property are the least distortive. And the other things are already referred to. As pointed out, let me speed up a bit, but there's an argument to use the tax system to internalize negative external effects, because in that case, we don't distort, we just force that smoker by paying that tax, by increasing that price, that he actually starts reducing consumption, and by the price starts internalizing the negative effects that he or she imposes on other people. The same applies to pollution, and already referred also to tax incentives, the case when you want to stimulate certain activities. This this is a very important concept on tax incidents, but for time's sake, let me go over that. And then, of course, that was all focused on the one hand on efficiency, but there's, of course, the important arguments on fairness, equity. We want to tax the concept of horizontal equity. People who are in the same situation, we want to tax them equally. There is the concept of vertical equity. People who are better off, we want to tax them at a higher rate. There's the concept of gender equity. We want to tax of men and women equally. And there's a concept of intergenerational equity. Now, let me remind you also that the tax system can affect inequality in a lot of different channels. First, the role, as said, the role is to collect revenues. And these revenues can be used to redistribute income. So that's the first channel for which tax policy affects inequality. Second, by actually directly redistributing income. By having progressive personal income taxes, you take away more income for the ones who have higher incomes than who have lower incomes. But very important also is that the tax system can reduce market income inequality. There's a role for the tax system to make your pie from which you redistribute, to make that pie as big as possible. So there's a role first to make the pie as big as possible, and then to use your tax system to slice your pie up in different pieces and to redistribute. That second one, the slicing up, is the second channel. The making your pie as big as possible is the first channel. And there, for instance, is that equality of opportunity, the skills, for instance, to make sure to use your tax system to incentivize people to invest in skills is a key element. And then also important is that in many countries, the taxes, basically you pay taxes to yourself. In countries, perhaps a bit less in yours because your social security contributions are very low, because you have a lot of compulsory private savings for pension and for health insurance. But in many countries where there's a lot of social security contribution, you pay a lot of tax when you work, but you get all these taxes back when you're retired or when you're sick. So you basically pay taxes to yourself, but in a different state of the world. The problem is that people don't understand that. So people are very opposed to taxes. But basically, they shouldn't be, because they get it all back, or to a large extent. And there are other criteria on design that you should create tax certainty, simplicity, and so on. But let me go. Now, moving to tax and inclusive growth, which is the topic of this presentation. First, don't fall in the static text-by-text design trap. There are a couple of arguments to make. Is that the quality of government matters a lot. If you have a very inefficient government, you might need a lot of tax revenue in order to redistribute a bit. Because if government is inefficient, there's a lot of money that falls through the cracks. So you need to invest a lot in getting your government that it functions as good as possible, in order to having to raise as little as possible to achieve that same outcome in redistributive terms. So that's very first important point, focus on the quality of government. And second is linked to this slide. This shows across the income distribution, on average across the countries in the OECD, the amount of transfers they get and the amount of taxes they pay. So the taxes are green, the transfers are blue. So you see that on average in the OECD, people, this is the income deciles, people in the lowest income deciles, they pay a little bit of tax, but they get a lot more in transfers back. And so on net position, they get, while you see that the richer, they still get some transfers. Like in my own country, even if you are very, very rich, you get child transfers. So child transfers in Belgium are not reduced when income rises. So everyone, if you got a child, you need to have a child, you get a child benefit. So you see, that's in the blue bar. But of course, richer pay a lot more tax, so they pay on net. So the key message here is that having a progressive tax system, first of all, it's not only the tax system, it's also the transfer system. You cannot see tax and transfers separately from each other. Having a progressive tax and benefit system as a whole, that's what you should focus on. Second, what is very important, and what everyone, a lot of, in particular, policymakers and public doesn't fully understand that, there's always this tendency to implement progressivity on a tax-by-tax basis. So people object to the VAT because it's not progressive. It's not a problem that the VAT is not progressive. You have other taxes that you can use to implement progressivity. The VAT is a big revenue raiser, and if you collect that revenue and then spend it in a way that the poor gain more, you have the desired outcome. So implementing progressivity on a tax-by-tax basis is wrong. So you should focus on the overall functioning, not only of your tax system, but also of your transfer system. And this is just a point that you pay taxes on average in the OECD. You see, when you work actually in your working age, you pay tax, and then afterwards you are a net receiver because you get the pension. The graph at the bottom is I got overexcited, and we've done just recently a project on Slovenia, and I wanted to talk about Slovenia as well and the challenges they face, but I don't have time for that. So let's now move to tax design for inclusive growth. I've got 5 minutes left. Let me give you some, bringing all of this knowledge together, how can tax system then be used to design and to stimulate inclusive growth? What's very important, as I already said, is to keep tax bases as broad as possible and to avoid tax expenditures, tax provisions that are mainly beneficial to the rich. So that's the first there on the corner. That also means that instead of having tax allowances, one should implement tax credits. You have, for instance, very generous, in your tax system, very generous tax allowance. What is a tax allowance? An allowance is an amount of income that you can deduct from taxable income. That means that the value of that allowance is increasing in your marginal tax rate. Because it values more for richer taxpayers because they have more income, so they pay a higher marginal tax rate. So instead of having a tax allowance, you should give a tax credit, which is a fixed amount of an amount that you can deduct from tax liability. So the amount of taxes you have to pay. That means if you give a tax credit, that values for everyone in the same way. So you should move from tax allowances to tax credits. You should strengthen the progressivity across the entire tax and transfer system. There's something on technology and recent trends, and you should focus on that the distribution of pre-tax income. Now, this is a story in particular of OECD countries where we levy a lot of social security contributions. In contrast to you, you have a very progressive personal income tax, but your social security contributions are very light. You do have a lot of these additional payments, but you basically, that goes to your private pension account, so you know that eventually you get that money back. Social security contributions are often levied at very high rates and flat rates, so everyone pays the same rate. That creates a high tax burden on low-income people. As a result, in many OECD countries, for low-income people, they are taxed so highly that it basically doesn't pay to work. Because, whatever you earn, it's basically taxed to a large extent away. So in that way, tax systems are designed such that they basically diminish the pie because they take away incentives for people to work at a lower income. And that's, of course, a very, very bad outcome. That's why we more and more call to countries to shift partly from social security contributions back into the personal income tax to strengthen the role of the personal income tax on average in the OECD countries. Another key topic, I thought there was another slide first. Focus here is on skills investments. There is a role for the tax system also to stimulate skills. It is very interesting to see, and Piers and I have written a study on that. If you're interested, the taxation and skills study, you can find it on the OECD website. If you don't find it, send us an email and we'll send it to you. There's a lot of focus on physical capital, and the tax systems across the world give a lot of tax provisions for R&D, for instance. There's a lot of tax subsidies for physical capital, which is to some extent strange because at the end, why not for human capital? Why do we stimulate physical capital while at the end of the day, it's not innovation doesn't happen on itself. It are people who have to innovate. And it are people who have to use these innovations. So instead of focusing on excessive stimulus of physical capital, one should start studying and thinking a lot more about stimulating human capital, because basically what we do now is through the tax system, we give companies an incentive to focus on physical capital. So basically what they end up, they create robots, which then basically take away, reduce, make jobs, take away jobs. So we basically use the tax system there in the wrong way. So we should start focusing a lot more on human capital. There's an enormous role for tax system when we want to get to inclusive growth, is to revisit the way we tax savings at the household level. This is on average. We finished recently a study, and Piers will talk about that tomorrow or on Wednesday as well, that we have calculated the effective tax burden on different household saving vehicles. And you see basically there's a wide variety in tax burdens across saving vehicles. The same applies to your country. There's a lot to be said. You need a broad reform, I think personally, on how you tax capital income. I mean, you exempt a certain amount of interest income, but you don't do that for equity income, which to my extent is a bit strange. You have capital gains tax, but you only tax 40% of capital gains. The logic of that, I don't fully get that. So there is an enormous role to revisit the way we tax capital income. And that is linked to an exciting trend in what's going on in the world now, which is the automatic exchange of financial account information. And I've personally, tomorrow, I'll talk a lot about that. But basically, in a nutshell, what has happened is that in the past, I'm from Belgium. Belgium is a very small country. So basically everyone had either an account in the Netherlands or Luxembourg. So you put your money in another country, and then you didn't declare that income to the Belgian tax administration. And Belgium didn't know because the Dutch or the Luxembourg authorities didn't share that information with the Belgian administration. So as a result of that, countries ended up in very low taxes on capital income because they couldn't otherwise, because otherwise capital was so mobile and would be hidden in other countries. So now the Dutch tax administration is automatically exchanging the information that it's got of capital income earned by Belgian tax residents, is automatically sharing that with the Belgian tax administration. And the same applies to South Africa. You are also, there are now I think over 70 countries that are part of the automatic exchange of information. A tax resident in South Africa, if he or she earns capital income in another jurisdiction, your tax administration will automatically get that capital income, and that's an opportunity to revisit the way we tax capital income. I'll talk a lot more about that tomorrow. If we want a better tax system, we should strengthen the way we tax immovable property. There's, again, I know these taxes are very unpopular, but as I said before, the house is the perfect, is totally immobile. So we should strengthen the way we tax recurrent taxes on immovable property. We're also there on your side. I think there's a lot of work to be done. You, on the one hand, have very low recurrent taxes, but you have very high transaction taxes, which are very distorted. Piers has got a long presentation on VAT, on the design of VAT. Your VAT is, in that sense, very well designed because you have a broad VAT base. The call in order to strengthen tax design is that one should take away the reduced rates on goods and services that are particularly consumed by the rich. For instance, many countries have a reduced VAT rate for restaurants, hotels, and that type of area. Now, who goes a lot to a restaurant? Well, these are the rich. Poor people don't have the money to go to a restaurant. So if you, and there's often a lot of arguments in favor of these reduced rates, but that's just a transfer to rich people. You don't want VAT reduced rates on goods that are particularly consumed by richer households. You don't want to do that. That's basically, I need to speed up a bit because I keep on getting messages. Let me move on. There is, in order to improve our tax systems, there's an enormous role to strengthen international tax cooperation. And in that sense, the changes in the tax system and the cooperation that's going on, that also already started a lot in the OECD, is very fascinating. We have this project on base erosion and profit shifting, where we try to improve the design of the corporate income tax. We do the same with exchange of information. That's strengthening residence-based taxation, if you want. We have a lot of work going on how the VAT can be, the design of the VAT can be improved. Now, these rules have been sharpened, but not so long time ago, if you bought an app over the internet, that purchase was not taxed with VAT. Because that company that you bought it from basically it wasn't registered for VAT in South Africa. So it was very easy. So you didn't pay VAT, and you were not going to declare yourself that you bought a good from a foreign supplier and declaring that to the tax administration and pay your VAT. Now, finally, all these rules have been changed. So if you buy now an app, or you buy through Amazon, whatever, Amazon is supposed to be registered in South Africa, and Amazon, because when you buy, you will say where that good will have to be delivered. So that delivery address is reveals where you will consume that good. So Amazon will levy your 15% VAT rate and send that money to the tax administration in South Africa. So all of that is because of the strengthened international tax cooperation that is going on. It's very important that we all move together. Because if you have countries that say like, I'm going to move alone, they take advantage. They can take advantage. So moving all together, irrespective of some countries recently who seem to be willing to only move on their own, that's not the way to go. It's all together. We build better tax systems and a fair and a more inclusive world. That's strongly where we believe in the OECD. This is, but you'll get the slides, this summarizes the overall principles how to design a pro-growth and inclusive growth tax system. Let me remind you the key conclusions there. Raising revenue and spending it in a fair, equitable way is important. Do not implement tax progressivity on a tax-by-tax basis. Keep your tax basis as broad as possible. Get rid of all these tax provisions that are in particularly beneficial to the rich. And if you do have these provisions, make sure that you design them properly, not by having them in the form of a tax allowance, so not in the form of an amount of income that you can deduct from your taxable income, but design them in a form as a tax credit of an amount that you can deduct from your tax liability, from the amount of tax you have to pay. In that sense, everyone will gain in the same way. It's very important. You have to tax bad, subsidize goods. You have to focus on skills. Make sure that your tax system does not distort too much, such that low-income people basically are disincentivized, do not participate in your economy, because then you create too large distortions. I didn't focus on the incidents, and do not, again, that systems approach is look at your tax systems in a comprehensive, coherent way. It's basically a system that you need to design your tax policy, your tax administration, and in your international tax system all together. That's the key message. I'm here. That's again my email address. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very much looking forward to receiving all your suggestions how you can contribute to make your tax system more inclusive. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that.